this time yesterday, President Trump threatened that a whole civilization would die unless Iran agreed to end the war and unblock the Straits of Hormuz. Iranians, in response, lined bridges and linked hands around power plants, some of them anyway, after a call from the country's leadership to protect infrastructure. As the deadline to the US president's ultimatum approached, news broke that a 2-week ceasefire had been brokered by Pakistan. The world is heaving a sigh of relief, but where does it actually leave us? 5.5 weeks of conflict have changed a lot in the world, and the big question I want to ask over the next half hour or so is, what have we learned about the military position of various countries, about the economic situation that we now find ourselves in, and the politics? Has this just gone a lot further in reshaping how the world works? To discuss these big questions, I'm joined by Laurel Rapp, Director of the US and North America Programme at Chatham House. Hello.
Good afternoon.
Laurel served as Deputy Director of the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Staff until 2025. Ali Fathollah-Nejad is a German-Iranian political scientist and author and director of the Centre for Middle East and Global Order in Berlin. Hi, Ali.
Good afternoon.
Great to have you with us this afternoon. And we've also got Ben Judah, commentator and former special advisor to Foreign Secretary David Lammy. Hi, Ben.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for coming on. I'm going to suggest that we do this in order. We discuss the military stuff, the economic stuff, and then the kind of big geopolitics and the diplomatic side of this. And I think we start with the military stuff for the simple reason that there's a ceasefire, and it's come about, well, because both sides think that now is the time to take a step back and figure out what could be done to avoid any more fighting. Ali, I want to come to you first to talk about Iran's military position, because I think a lot of people 5.5 weeks ago might have thought that Iran was quite vulnerable, and if the US went in with some of its big bombers, that the Iranian infrastructure would crumble pretty quickly. But that hasn't happened really, has it? Ali, is it fair to say that Iran's defences are a bit more robust than many people thought?
Well, one could certainly say that, because Iran has been given the asymmetry in military capabilities vis-a-vis Israel, and the United States has decided to engage in an asymmetric war. And for that, they've been launching, mostly missiles, but also drones, and not only against Israel, which is one of the aggressors, so to speak, but also against the Arab states of the Gulf, which have not been really party of this war. So it has been more than just a mere asymmetric warfare. It has been a kind of strategy to basically bring down the entire region if regime survival is at stake. And when it comes to the question about Iran's military strength right now, we have to factor in that we've seen thousands of US and Israeli targeted strikes against Iran's military infrastructure, the missile infrastructure, the military industrial complex. So all of that has to be accounted for, and given the fog of war, we're not really sure about the level of weakness or of strength of Iran's armed forces. Plus, they've been, important decapitations of key military figures. So the Iranians have somehow decentralized their military responses. But also military decapitations of top figures, likewise political decapitations, are of course important.
They are important indeed. Laurel, let me bring you in, Director of the US and North America Programme at Chatham House. How is this being viewed this morning in the White House? We know that President Trump is always going to claim victory, but has the US achieved what it wanted?
The U.S. had set a range of goals and objectives, some of which were clearer than others and others that shifted over time. And what we heard over these past 5 weeks is there was a goal to attack Iran's ballistic missile defense system, its nuclear ambitions, proxies across the region, and then the regime itself, the leadership apparatus. And so in the past several hours since this ceasefire has been announced, we heard from the Pentagon facts and figures of the degree to which the United States has addressed some of the air defense. 80% of Iran's air defense destroyed, according to the Pentagon. 800 drone storage facilities destroyed. 450 ballistic missile storage facilities destroyed. 150 ships. But the broader question is what this adds up to be. Does this address the broader goals and objectives in dismantling the missile system? It does not. Does it address the nuclear fissile material that still remains in Iran? It does not. And it very much does not address the question of the disposition of the regime and its survival. What's interesting, President Trump put out some press statements recently saying regime change has happened in Iran because there's a new leader in power. I would not assess that as how the White House was thinking about it 5 weeks ago, but that's the sort of the shaped message that the White House is now saying, look, in certain areas they have, in their view, accomplished what they tried to do. I think for many American people, they would not share that view that this operation has been a success.
Let me just bring in a clip of the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth speaking earlier today.
The world's leading state sponsor of terrorism proved utterly incapable of defending itself, its people, or its territory. We untied just a fraction of our strength, and Iran suffered a devastating military defeat.
So, Laurel, that's what the US administration is arguing. The other thing, a theory I've heard around Westminster is that President Trump was emboldened by what happened in Venezuela, where they went in, they took the leader out, and basically they got a new head of state who was a bit more amenable to the US. Is there an overconfidence in the White House, or was there rather an overconfidence at the beginning of this conflict in Iran that maybe hasn't matched the reality?
I agree there were lessons the Trump administration took from the success, as one might say, in Venezuela, if the goal was to simply swap out leaders, right, to bring Maduro to a jail cell in Brooklyn without collapsing Venezuela's economy or security forces. If that was the goal, then that was achieved. And so with significant U.S. leverage and influence across Venezuela. Venezuela submits a monthly budget to the U.S. for approval before funds can be unlocked. There was an attempt, it seemed, to do a bit of a cut and paste to the Iran context, but of course it's a very, very different context. And the goals and objectives the Trump administration put out were much more expansive, were shifting. And that then created a challenge for the U.S. military, for U.S. diplomats, for allies and partners who share concerns about Iran's behavior and activities in the region, but did not have the clearest sense of what the best remedy was here, or there were very sharp divergences on what the best remedy was here. And so what we have here now is kind of a claiming of success of quote unquote mission accomplished, while a lot of the underlying triggers for this conflict in the first place have not been resolved. Parties now have 2 weeks, or the Trump administration has set 2 weeks to hammer out the details of what are two pretty divergent sets of priorities and principles that both sides have put forward. Very sweeping and longstanding demands on both sides, and so there may be more urgency to get to an agreement because it will be, over a barrel of a gun, but this will not be an easy 2 weeks ahead.
Ben, you're a former advisor to David Lammy when he was Foreign Secretary. Let me bring you in. There's been a lot of debate going on in the UK about where our military is and how ready it is for potential conflict. We saw that at the start of this war when there was no warships ready to go out to the Mediterranean. What's your kind of sense of how what have we learnt about the UK's war readiness over the last few weeks?
What I think we've seen as regards the Iran file really over the last year is that British diplomacy has actually been pretty good at guessing the direction of travel, pushing for a deal when there still was a deal on the table as far back as last year, anticipating that this was going to go awry, advising the Prime Minister that the correct course of action was to try and stay out of it. But as your question suggests, the UK's military readiness, the state of the Royal Navy, and the state of our armed forces in general, after a rundown of more than 20 years, has left the UK in a poor position. And I think a lot more needs to be done there. There's going to be a need for higher defence spending, but that cuts against what is still likely, even though there is a quasi ceasefire for now, to me to be the increased geo-economic costs that are going to hit the UK as a result of this war, meaning that there will be less money to go around than there already was to do with certain price hikes, making the economy less competitive than it was before.
Ben, we know that the government has committed to increasing defence spending to 2.5% and then eventually to 3%. But do you think there's actually the will in government to find that money? The Chancellor seems to be reluctant to put up tax to pay for this. And as you'll know, various departments are reluctant to see their budget cut to make sure that there's more money for defence. So is the will there to find this cash from the government pot?
I think we just got to be honest here, which is not simply a problem about politicians. It's also a problem about the public. The public are extremely resistant to the tax burden going any higher. The tax burden's already historically high. And that is being fed through to politicians, and that's influencing them when they are making decisions. One of the things that you see when you look at polling and focus groups is that the public either assumes the money's already been spent, assumes the money's been baked in, and isn't really willing to actually move resources from one bucket or another to fund defence. So that's what the politicians are getting from the British people, and it doesn't feel good if you are, like myself, a believer in the need for rising defence spending. And then there's also a long-term track record which the Ministry of Defence and the British military industrial complex has, which is just being an absolutely terrible manager of public procurement and public funds. And there's a lot of suspicion from the Treasury of simply pouring money into the MOD for a lot of very good reasons. So those two trends are really intersecting in government decision making right now. My personal belief is that sadly we are not going to see a dramatic hike in defence spending to really turn things around fast, unless there is something that feels like a crisis to the British population. And this is not that.
Well, let's talk about one area where people are feeling it at the moment, which is the economic impact of this war. There's a really interesting report that's just gone up on the Financial Times saying that Iran is going to charge $1 per barrel of oil to go through the Straits of Hormuz, and they want it to be paid in digital currencies like crypto. So it feels like that crisis, even if the Straits open, is not totally done, and that prices could potentially go up as a result. Ben, when you look at the UK's position, the government thinks that we're really vulnerable to economic shocks, but its plan is long term. It's not going to change in the next 2 or 3 years, is it?
We're absolutely vulnerable to these kinds of economic shocks. We're vulnerable because of jet fuel shortages. We're vulnerable because of the price of fertilizer, and fertilizer is mostly imported. We're vulnerable because of the link of electricity prices in the UK to the gas price, and we're vulnerable because of what's happened to those gas fields out around Qatar and because of what's happening in the Straits. But just to come back to what we were discussing previously, which is what's the public expecting out of this? Well, a lot of the public is actually expecting some kind of energy price bailout, hugely expensive. And that would mean vast amounts of our limited resources going towards keeping bills down and not going to the Ministry of Defence, not
But the
going.
government doesn't want to do it, does it? It's kind
Doesn't
of
want to do
made,
it, but
made
that's
it
why
clear it will be
that's why it's
targeted.
not simply a problem of politicians. It's a problem of public expectations, which is if you really ask the public what they don't actually want a massive defence spending to be prioritised. They want their bills to be protected first. That's what you're getting if you're a politician.
Laurel Rapp, who is our expert on the US and North America, help me understand a bit about how the cost of living debate is having an influence in the United States. Is Trump and the administration in the US worried about the impact that the war's having on the cost of living?
They are absolutely worried about the cost. Americans have seen rising gas prices, oil and gas prices, more expensive to heat homes, to drive your cars. These are key kitchen table issues for Americans, and this will be increasingly critical as Americans go to the polls in November during the midterms to determine whether the House or the Senate flips to Democrats, which would really change the composition of how U.S. foreign policy is made and domestic policy is made. Look, Americans are a bit more sheltered from the catastrophic energy disruptions we've been seeing across Europe and Asia, of course, the Middle East, because the U.S. has been, under the Trump administration, doing huge oil and gas production. And so the U.S. is a net exporter of oil and gas. Nonetheless, prices are still rising. And what we've seen is sometimes in this Iran conflict, you had political objectives and economic objectives cutting across each other. And the Trump administration's decision to lift oil sanctions on Iran's oil was quite telling. That they said the Trump administration values a higher volume of oil on the market than it does continuing to constrain Iran's ability to sell oil. So that was quite a telling political decision from Washington. It's driven by polling. It's driven by Americans caring more than anything about in the midterms the cost of living. Foreign policy usually ranks pretty low on the list of priorities for Americans. Americans are also worried about inflation, and this war is having an inflationary effect that will continue to bear out, and the effects of which we will see for months to come, which will make everyday groceries and consumer goods much more expensive.
Ali Fathollah-Nejad, our expert on Iran in this discussion. How much of an issue is the cost of living in Iran? Is it something that the regime faces pressure over?
No, absolutely. It's one of the major crises, if not the most important of all the structural crises that have been inflicted by the policies of the Islamic Republic on the nation. The socio-economic crisis is now so vast that a clear majority of Iranians live in poverty. From last autumn onwards, the inflation rate has reached a realm of hyperinflation.
Has the war made that worse?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the most recent figures suggest that we have an official inflation rate of 60 or 70%. So unofficially, it could be much, much higher than that. We've had some reports earlier this year when the largest anti-regime protests were happening that the regime could not pay the salaries of the repressive forces. So the economic crisis is going to be enormous because of the damages of the war, because of the decision by the authorities to shut down the internet. And a lot of Iranians are, engaging in the e-business and so forth. So there's a lot of, different factors of this economic crisis that could be the most important Achilles heel for the regime in the mid to long term.
But it looks like Iran could do pretty well out of this deal to reopen the Straits of Hormuz, if the FT report that I was just talking about is correct, that they're going to charge $1 per barrel of oil going through the Straits over the next foreseeable future, that could make the country a lot of money. And I suppose in that sense, does it give us a sense that even if militarily Iran can't match the US, it does have some economic leverage here, which is hurting?
Well, we have to bear in mind that given the political structure and the political economy of the Islamic Republic, much of the money that is earned goes to regime entities. We've now, over the last 1 or 2 years, we have a budget that says that a great portion, if not half, of oil exports go directly to the armed forces. So it's not going to necessarily trickle down onto the population, and there are areas where the regime can spend that money. But when it comes to taking fees for shipping, for the passage of ships through the Strait of Hormuz, this point is as uncertain as the other points that are presented, at least from the Iranian side, in that 10-point plan to be the basis for negotiations. So every single major aspect is hugely uncertain. There is a wide gulf between the two positions, between the Iran and the United States. Just take, for instance, Iran's call to get rid of all sanctions, to get rid of all UN Security Council resolutions, and also all resolutions from the IAEA Board of Governors. Okay. The payment of compensation for damages inflicted on Iran could be made through taking fees, but again, this also is quite uncertain. We could think of a scenario where Iran and Oman are going to do it together, but this again will not be, acceptable to a lot of regional countries and beyond. Okay. And also the question is whether, the ceasefire entails a kind of ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is also not clear. So none of that is clear by now.
Yeah, and there are even questions in the last few minutes being asked about the extent to which the ceasefire is holding. The Pakistani Prime Minister has just sent a message to various people, including President Trump, and to the Iranians, saying that violations of the ceasefire have been reported over the last few hours. They undermine the spirit of the peace process. He's urging all parties to exercise restraint. We'll keep bringing you updates on that over the course of the afternoon here on 5 Live. Right, we've talked about the military lessons of the last few weeks. We've talked about some of what we've learned on the economic front. I want to focus in the last few minutes, guys, if that's okay, on what we've learned about geopolitics, about what this means for politics across the world, which I'm guessing is quite a lot. But Laurel Rapp from Chatham House, I want to come to you first and talk about what it means for the United States. I mean, we know that President Trump does not play by the normal political rule book. He's been ripping it up for years. But has the last few weeks shown just how much alliances have shifted and how the relationship between the US and its traditional allies is frayed?
It has. We were seeing previews of this over the last year with Greenland on the national security strategy, but the U.S. split from Europe was quite profound on this one. Look, it wasn't just Europe, though. It was a lot of other countries around the world that had major concerns and reservations about this U.S. Operation. It was Israel that was supportive. Privately, Gulf countries probably would have assessed that dealing with Iran's nuclear material regime disposition in some fashion was in their interest as well. But so we've also learned that partner and ally input into the United States right now is less material than it used to be. There's not consultation done in advance. And then there is kind of threats and leverage and coercion used to try to bring those traditional partners into the fight. And that was a very hard decision the UK and others had to make.
It's interesting.
The other piece,
just one quick, we were talking about this on the show yesterday, and we had a couple of people saying that they just don't think anyone has Donald Trump's ear anymore. Some of the messages that he was firing off on social media over the last few days, including the one where he talked about a whole civilization being wiped out, which I think even people who've got used to President Trump were quite shocked by some of his language there. Have we just seen now that this White House is all about Donald Trump. There are no real checks and balances on him, and that's likely to continue while he's president.
There are very few checks on this White House and on this president, from countries and actors around the world, from within the United States system itself. Congress traditionally would play a very strong role here, the courts as well. With a Republican-controlled Congress, there has been relative silence over the past 24 hours, including on the language you referenced, which effectively calls for genocide. It calls for war crimes to wipe out an entire civilization. Is not something the American people would support. Of course, it's just, perhaps his supporters would say, "Oh, well, this was a negotiating tactic," but when you begin to break those norms and just throw everything, any language, no matter how reprehensive, into the mix, you really undermine a lot of the long-term credibility of the United States, and that's a big risk here. And look, just one other point on the sort of geopolitics of this. Hormuz is an economic component, opening or closing. It's also a huge geopolitical component. Iran had sought, in its telling, to pursue a nuclear weapons program because, or any country does, because it can have a deterrent effect, right, on threats from other countries. Iran has chanced upon quite a powerful deterrent here in a unilateral ability to open and close the Strait of Hormuz. And so if you're looking at the longer term standing of, has Iran improved or degraded its position in this conflict? At least on the narrow question of Hormuz, its position has been strengthened because it now has that ability to hold international shipping, energy markets hostage when it chooses to do so.
Let me bring in Ali Fathollah-Nejad to talk a bit more about the political impact of all of this on Iran. What have we learned, Ali, about the Iranian regime? We know that several dozens of top people, the very elites of Iranian politics and the Iranian state were killed by the US and Israel in their strikes. The White House says, look, this is effectively regime change. It's what we wanted. Is that a fair analysis?
Well, Trump has been, misreading the nature and the structure of the Iranian regime, for instance, in comparison to the case of Venezuela. So the Iranian regime is highly ideological. So ideology and resistance against the United States and Israel is a key element, also within the propaganda, also within the armed forces. Plus the fact that such a Venezuela outcome would not have been possible, as one of the previous speakers said, because there was no such previous U.S. contacts with any kind of Iranian elements within. The only one thing one should add is that there is a huge gulf between state and society in Iran. And this also, has to be accounted for. The war just happened a few weeks after the historic massacre that the Iranian regime has committed against its own people, killing within a matter of a few days, probably tens of thousands of people. So this is also complicated, and this has also fed some kind of, expectations from at least some parts of the Iranian population that the war may be a war of liberation. But then again, the reality is that there is a huge gap between geopolitical goals of Israel or the United States and the aspirations of the Iranian people. But this kind of gap that I just explained between state and society in Iran is not going to disappear. And this is going to be a very defining feature of Iranian political developments down the road.
There was talk at the start of the conflict. President Trump was talking about Iranian people taking back their country, presumably a reference to some of those protests we've seen over the last few years, which felt like they were growing and growing. There's still a regime of sorts in place. There's still an Ayatollah in charge. He's still got the same name as the last one. For those Iranian opposition figures who are hoping for change, how will they feel at the end or during this ceasefire after 5.5 weeks of fighting?
Listen, we have to, because of the fog of war, and we have to wait to have a clearer judgment about the state of affairs with the regime, because we can surely think that it has been weakened militarily, but also its repressive apparatus. There is a huge economic problem. There are all those other structural crises, environmental crisis, a political crisis, the gender crisis, and also the socio-economic crisis that are going to come back. And so the authorities have to deal with all those crises to which they have no policy answers whatsoever once the war ends. So this is why within the current Iranian regime, there are elements who are calculating that it would be much better for Tehran to continue the war. Because they would think that this is going to be a stabilizing element. Now, with the war ending, or at least the ceasefire now being more or less in place, we see one major fear of Iranian society actually materializing, which is that the judiciary is going to accelerate the death penalty. We don't have to forget that there are tens of thousands of political prisoners in Iran. So, another massacre is actually feared. So this situation really needs much of international attention. Human rights is neither part of the Trump administration's demands vis-a-vis Iran, nor, of course, it is part of the Iranian 10-point plan. So there is a responsibility here for the international community, given the grave level of human rights violations that we've seen just recently, earlier this year, to have a very close look at what is going on now.
Laurel, let me bring you back in, Laurel Rapp from Chatham House, who's the director of the US and North America programme. What impact has this had on the relationship between the US and the UK? We've seen President Trump firing off broadsides about Keir Starmer and the state of the US military. Is that something that's short term that can be fixed, or has some permanent damage been done?
There's been tension in the US-UK relationship for a couple of months now. It was crescendoed during Greenland and Prime Minister Starmer's line in the sand that the US should not take Greenland by force or otherwise, joined by many European leaders as well. This now, the President Trump has seemed to single out Prime Minister Starmer in some ways because of the early refusal for the US to use UK military bases for offensive action in Iran. And so this relationship will continue to be rocky. The sort of long-standing US-UK special relationship has so many shared interests and so many shared values, and has been aligned on a lot of the military objectives through the years, of course, with some differences in places like Iraq, in the early 2000s. Yeah. But we're now starting to see more fundamental divergences as the Trump administration is putting forward its foreign policy, is executing its foreign policy agenda. The longer question here is, when there is new leadership in the White House, will those interests and values go back to what they had been over the past decades? Or will we be in a new world in which there has been a bit of a resetting of how the US sees the world and how it might be distinct from the UK's approach?
A big question to end on, one we can't answer right now, but we will keep an eye on over the next few weeks. Remember, the Prime Minister's in the Middle East at the moment, the UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. If we hear anything more from him, we'll bring it to you. Benjura, Laurel Rapp and Ali Fathollah-Nejad, thank you so much for helping us understand a bit more about the impact and what we've learnt from the war in the Middle East over the last few weeks. The time is 15:38. We're a bit late. Sorry, Fraser. Let's get a news update.